The other division that we found to be pretty interesting, we wanted to spotlight, was the NFC East, which is maybe not the division that people would think right away. And we're kind of talking through the Niners a little bit. And there's a lot of interesting teams in the NFC West. The NFC South has the Falcons, who are a fun team. We'll get to those divisions.
And you're showing your anti-East Coast bias here when, the Cowboys and Philadelphia Eagles fans listening are aghast that people
The
don't
NFC
think
East. The NFC East
division
sucks, and I hate the East Coast. No, I'm just kidding. But yes,
everyone should move to Seattle.
Yeah, that's right. Well, maybe not Seattle. It's not the best. We can't even play Underdog.
Do you want your housing prices to go up even higher?
Yeah, that's, look, I own a house in the city. If you want to make the housing prices go up, maybe I could sell it and move to somewhere where I can actually play fantasy football. Anyway, Dallas and Philly, strong top two teams in the NFC East. Washington and the Giants, sort of overlooked. You had an interesting take from me before we started about those two teams. I say sort of overlooked, but Washington is, we have Jaden Daniels there. They're certainly talked about. It's an exciting next step, although not quite sure about some of the hiring process, the targets. They really wanted Ben Johnson. There was some stuff about Mike McDonald, who winds up in Seattle, and then they seem to just sort of have Dan Quinn on speed dial as like their backup plan, and he's now their head coach.
Did their offensive coordinator, was he a really successful NFL coach at his last stop?
Yeah, he did really great, and then he went back to college just because he wanted to, and he was really good there too. He had the number 1 overall pick, and they were incredible. No, the USC's offense was good last year, but it is a little odd that he went back to USC for a year, was the offensive coordinator there, and the USC underwhelmed, mostly because of their defense, but had an underwhelming season. And now Cliff Kingsbury gets another opportunity to come to the NFL and coach another young mobile quarterback, which we saw how that went with Kyler. By the end of the final season there, Kyler was coming off the field and getting caught taking off his helmet and cussing out his coach. The lip reading was not.
And that was the only time they would talk to each other.
Yeah.
These guys disliked each other so much that they very specifically put a video game clause in his contract with the only purpose of embarrassing him, because you're not going to enforce that.
Anyway, Cliff Kingsbury is back. He's coaching Jaden Daniels. You're in on Jaden Daniels. You drafted a lot of him. You and our buddy Peter Overzet at the Best Ball Banana Stand have built some Washington stacks, I know, in some of your early drafts here. Daniels is a fairly straightforward decision, though, in fantasy football when you're talking about his rushing ability, and his current pricing is pretty nice, honestly. But you're not super, super high on Washington. They are a 6.5 win total. They're being bet a little bit to the over. The Giants are a 6.5 win total. They're being bet a little bit harder to the under. And you said to me before the show that it's pretty straightforward that the Giants should be picked ahead of Washington.
Well, there were only two teams last year with a point differential worse than negative 150, and the Commanders were dead last at minus 189. That was worse than the Carolina Panthers, with Bryce Young looking, basically like Zach Wilson, right? And the Panthers not being good otherwise as well. And so, you need this team to take a pretty serious jump, even with, a win total that is not aggressive. And they have some of those things in place. They spend pretty big on the defensive front seven. They add something to the O-line. This is a team also that has 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. So it's not just Jaden Daniels that they're adding. This should be a team that over time is filling out. They really bottomed out last year, and it was sort of unfortunate in its own way that Ron Rivera gets caught in some of that. It's unfortunate It's unfortunate that Bieniemy gets caught in some of that. I think it's arguably unfortunate that Howell gets caught in some of that. But all of those things were definitely true. They moved some of their defensive pieces. They were just an absolute train wreck. I mean, this is a team that very clearly is pointing more at 2025 or even 2026. But the win total isn't that aggressive. And so if you do have some of these moves hit, then you can get to it. Obviously, when you move away from the fantasy front, people are worried about these hits that Jaden Daniels has been taking. You have concerns about his ability to stay healthy. You have some concerns about how that allows, especially at the NFL level, drive success. How do you keep the drives going when you're having these negative types of plays? And do you have the talent around that to make it work? And one of the things that they've said is they're going to run the ball. And taking the ball out of his hands is not the solution either. But despite what Terry McLaurin brings to the table, this isn't a team that has weapons for him. And so I think that you have to consider that even with all of the additions they made, and we kind of like the Luke McCaffrey selection, but it's also a weird one where, somewhat similar to another NFC East team where we like the fact that Will Shipley went earlier than he could have gone, but you are frustrated that he goes behind Barkley and to a team that doesn't throw the ball to the running back. McCaffrey, as a guy who's been an underneath weapon, is an odd pick to go with Jaden Daniels, who is a scrambling and mobile quarterback. There's so much we don't know yet about the Commanders, but I have a lot of skepticism about some of the high-profile moves that they made this offseason, setting up the organization to rebuild. And certainly I love Daniels there, but everything else about it raises red flags.
And when you talk about McCaffrey's fit, and, I'm going to pull Ben Sinnott into this because we just talked about how good Trey McBride is, and we watched Cliff Kingsbury not play Trey McBride so he could play as an aging Zach Ertz just a couple of years ago. And then the next coaching staff took over and said, no, we're going to play Trey McBride. This guy's really good. Like when they saw him in practice and they're like, yeah, we're going to do that.
Well, after Ertz got hurt, for some reason, Ertz had himself an in with the Cardinals, whatever it was.
True. It's true. But now that Cliff Kingsbury is there in Washington, they signed Ertz and cut Logan Thomas right away during the free agency period. I saw that as a pretty clear signal. They were like, we don't even need to keep this other guy. That was before they knew they had Sinnott. Ertz is our starter. And then now, look, they've drafted Sinnott. I know that there's a lot of optimism, but some of the stuff about him being an H-back and some of those things, I'm a little bit worried that you're going to get Ertz playing traditional tight end early in the season and Sinnott doing some fullbacky stuff at times and in on two tight end sets, but a little bit too gimmicky for my liking. And so when I play Daniels, I would actually say, because you also have receiver issues here, right? Jahan Dotson has not emerged. He's just not been that dude. Was efficient as a rookie in terms of fantasy production, had a lot of touchdowns, but not as great in terms of actually earning volume and that stuff. And then a really tough second season. McLaurin, interestingly enough, is a number one who's never really dominated and concentrated volume. But the way that I've been thinking about the Daniels thing is if you want to play him and you want to stack him up, it's really easy to backstack him with Sinnott and McCaffrey, and I don't mind that. And I know you guys have done a little bit of that, you and Pete, but I think optimally you probably want to have McLaurin because I think you want them to be doing some of the RPO stuff, which I wrote about last year leads to a higher target share for the number one receiver. I think you really want McLaurin to be smashing, basically, which then you have to draft McLaurin first to set up the deal. That's the optimal way to do it, in my opinion. It doesn't mean you can't draft Daniels if you don't have McLaurin. But really, when I think about a Daniels breakout in year one, it's it's got to be McLaurin. It's not going to really be McCaffrey or Sinnott, at least in terms of my read on the ways that I'm concerned about Cliff Kingsbury's ability to utilize his talent. I'm just I think the number one guy there that's shown us something in the past, McLaurin, not amazing number one stuff, but something more than what Dotson's shown and some of these other, De'Ami Brown, whoever else they have on their in their receiving room. They don't have Curtis Samuel anymore. It's not a strong room. Now, obviously, the deal with Daniels is the rushing. So a big part of it is also that you can kind of just play him without any stack. And if you're throwing in, a back stack when you do him in best ball, you're like, well, his rushing's going to get us there. And then I have a guy who could catch some touchdowns in the playoff weeks. And especially if it's a late season emergence for a Synod or something. I mean, that can obviously all work out. I'm not saying, but I'm basically saying if you get Daniel's really, really strong season, I think it's got to come through McLaurin. It's just really from an analytical perspective, it's really the take that I would have there. But anyway.
And for Daniels, he wasn't a guy who went out and had a huge number of downfield passes by percentage compared to Drake May and Michael Penix, which those guys are talked about because of the downfield passing. But when he did throw down the field, he was effective much more than they were. Now, again, I mean, he's throwing to Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, and so it's apples and oranges, right? But if McLaurin can get behind the defense, I mean, McLaurin is an air yards guy, and so there is a decent fit there. The other thing, now that we do have the schedule, we'll talk about it later in the show if you're listening to the full audio, but the Atlanta Falcons, very heavy favorites in the NFC South. That's the Week 17 matchup, and you could very easily end up with Drake London and Kyle Pitts on your roster because you want them, whereas the Washington guys is almost forcing to make this work. I wouldn't be surprised if Daniels by himself just with Atlanta is the way to play it.
That would be a fun way to play it. Daniels with no stack other than the bringbacks in Week 17. So you said the Giants. So, I mean, we just talked a little bit about Washington. There's a lot of question marks. There's a lot of question marks about the talent on the roster. I think there's question marks about the coaching staff. I think I actually tweeted a while back that I feel bad for Washington fans and like this sounds condescending, but just from the perspective of you finally got rid of Dan Snyder and you really that had to have been like, that's got to be one of the most frustrating things as a fan in any sport to have Dan Snyder as your owner for as long as he was, and all the scandal and everything that went along with that. The lawsuits with the cheerleaders and the other issues within the organization, and you finally replace that, and that's good, and that's all a positive, and we're moving forward positively, and that's all strong. The way that the Ben Johnson thing went down, the McDonald weird thing, and then landing on Dan Quinn, and then hiring Cliff Kingsbury, and then some of the other things that have happened this offseason as well. They're not all coming to me immediately, but I know there's a couple other that were just didn't look great. It's at least you don't have Dan Snyder, but it's tough to like feel like the process maybe hasn't massively improved, and it's new stuff. And I know there's a desire to defend that. I know there's people that really like Adam Peters, the general manager. I look at the Quinn Kingsbury staff and I'm not inspired. And I would say that if there's any staff in the league that looks like this year's like Nathaniel Hackett hire or Adam Gase hire, or like, it's the retread who didn't actually elevate anything. I think Dan Quinn's, a great guy. Everyone talks about him very favorably, but there's a chance that like we're criticizing these offenses with the early Kyler Murray career stuff. We were like, man, what happened to the air raid? This is the horizontal raid. Like what is Cliff Kingsbury calling? There's a chance that like the offense just looks so dysfunctional, and we're very frustrated with Jaden Daniels being held back by the system and the offense and all of those things. So anyway, not trying to be too hard on Washington, but I did want to get that out there because I don't think it's being discussed really enough, or maybe it is in Washington circles, but I have some real concerns about Washington's coaching staff. And it fits in with what you were saying about them maybe being the favorite to finish last in this division instead of a little bit ahead of the Giants, who people are down on. Brian Daboll was everyone's favorite coach after 2022. He gets a Giants team that have been struggling for years into the postseason and wins a playoff game. The Giants made some questionable decisions last offseason. We talked about it. They probably should have just franchise tagged Daniel Jones. They made the decision to franchise tag Saquon and extend Daniel Jones at the 11th hour, which committed them to Daniel Jones over multiple years. And then also Saquon did the obvious thing and just held out, because his franchise tag is way different than Daniel Jones's. Daniel Jones would have got a lot more money from the franchise tag over 1 year, but you could have got more information they ultimately, and they would have probably let him walk this offseason. They had so much invested in him that they ended up drafting Malik Neighbors. They probably would have let him walk and drafted a quarterback instead this year if they went that route. They could have let Saquon walk last year. They ultimately signed Saquon for the 1-year deal, keep him in-house, and then they let him walk the very next year. So they probably could have just let him walk last offseason. At any rate, they are kind of quote-unquote stuck with Daniel Jones, but I am saying quote-unquote meaningfully because he's just a year removed from leading them to the postseason and winning a playoff game. He's probably not the worst quarterback in the entire NFL. He's got his flaws. They didn't have a lot of pass game weapons last year. Should we be at least a little bit optimistic about the Giants this year now that they've added Malik Neighbors? I mean, that is something that really changes the whole texture rather than needing Jalen Hyatt or Wan'Dale Robinson to be the guy. If Malik Neighbors is what he's billed to be, those guys could be interesting ancillary pieces. And suddenly you actually have a whole, passing game built out, down to the, I feel a lot better about Wan'Dale Robinson as the wide receiver too, as the underneath guy with Neighbors challenging down the field and Hyatt challenging down the field on the other side. I mean, that could be great from Wan'Dale Robinson and the way that he gets used. It's not just the passing game, but Giants are they being a little bit overlooked? I mean, like, why can't we go back? I guess the way that I want to frame this is 2023 what they really were or are, or is 2022 what they really are under Brian Daboll?
And really everything fell apart so quickly last season. We didn't necessarily get a chance to see. One of the things I've been talking a little bit with Connor about, one of the elements that is very compelling for 2024 is late QB in a variety of formats and not just from a floor perspective. Because you look at Daniel Jones in 2022, depending on what scoring format you're using, these numbers will shift a little bit, but he averages 20.5 points per game and he has 44% QB1 finishes. I mean, this is a guy who, even just looking at it from a fantasy perspective there, did bring things to the table in that 2022 season that resulted in the unfortunate, but in some ways justified contract extension, especially when you consider what the market for quarterbacks is. And then you throw in what you just mentioned, which is that instead of going to the QB position, which they were rumored as a strong possibility to do in this year's draft, and now you've got a ton of resources on redundant types of things, and there's no way to hit a home run outcome, really, right? I mean, your best case scenario is just that new quarterback that you draft then sets you up for some type of success somewhere down the line. When you draft Malik Neighbors, I mean, you could have a very dynamic offense this season because, as you mentioned with Wan'Dale, he's somebody who, again, the college number is fantastic, more athletic than people realize. Jalen Hyatt, great speed, vertical threat there. Needed some quarterback play last year. The compliments that those guys could be to a Malik Neighbors, who should be a franchise-changing wide receiver. Now they put themselves in a position where they can, like, for once and for all, really evaluate Daniel Jones. And I think you want to, now that you paid him anyway, you want to do that before you move on. And now you have a scenario where if those things do come together, you could hit in a huge way. You look at the overall team setup, and they do have 3 meaningful losses in free agency. That's not anything to ignore when the team is already bad, right? But they make a couple of investments in the offensive line. And this is an offensive line that ranked 30th in run blocking points earned per snap. So EPA then split out to who's responsible for it. In this case, SIS is saying the offensive line was responsible for very poor play in that category, but 31st in pass blocking points earned per snap. This was a terrible, terrible offensive line, which made it difficult for Saquon, and it made it difficult for anybody who was the quarterback behind them. Even if you don't fix that overnight, to have made a couple of additions there to try and solidify that could help. And then beyond the neighbor selection, they used the draft to add in the secondary and replace their like big free agency loss at the position. So they've been able to neutralize some of the losses. They've been able to address some of the weaknesses, and they put this offense together now in a way where, is it still more likely than not that things don't work and they're looking for a quarterback next year? And that's probably true. But even with more likely than not being a negative, there's extreme upside here.
This feels like the Bucs from last year, where everybody was just writing off this offense as not functional, and you can't draft Mike Evans, you can't draft Chris Godwin. The Godwin thing didn't really work out. You can't play Baker Mayfield really, really late because he's going to get benched for Kyle Trask. And I mean, Drew Lock had a nice start for Seattle. I think he had the one start last year, but he's shown us that he's probably not the dude.
There's no accuracy. I mean, he can't hit his targets. There's no way you can play him.
And so you don't really have a big threat to Daniel Jones in that regard, as you didn't to Baker. People thought, and then the discussion in camp was, well, Baker Mayfield can't even beat out Kyle Trask. How bad is that? Well, he ended up playing a good enough year that was an interesting offense for fantasy. That's what the Giants feel like to me completely, that everyone has just completely written them off and forgets that 2 years ago, I mean, as bad as last year was, 2 years ago, they weren't that bad. And they were horrible in 2021 and earlier as well. So that's why nobody wants to remember 2022. But they were actually a pretty interesting offense in 2022. They did some things right.
With Richie James and Isaiah Hodgins.
Right. Exactly. So anyway,
and those guys played well. I mean, it's not to criticize them, but that they were, using backup pieces and having success.
Yeah. They've made some additions to the defense. They got Brian Burns. They got all that stuff going for them this year. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. That's the bottom of the NFC East. You mentioned the top teams, the Eagles, the Cowboys. I don't have like really strong points on either of those teams. I think on the Cowboys, it's more like consistent. We got Mike McCarthy sticking around. Not like major changes in the passing game. You obviously have no more Tony Pollard. They bring back Zeke. I don't know how the Zeke and Rico Dowdle thing is going to go. I'd be curious to know if you're considering drafting Zeke at all. I personally have not been able to pull that trigger. He got up there pretty quick in ADP to where it was like, all right, well, I can easily pass at this price. The Eagles, I think, is more interesting to me, though. I don't know. Do you have any big thoughts on the Cowboys? The other one to talk about, I think, is Jake Ferguson, who I think is probably the most overpriced tight end, because there actually is a really interesting next tier, and he's going like meaningfully ahead of Njoku, and he's just a routes guy. He ran a ton of routes, Ferguson, but he's not adding a ton in terms of like targets per run and any of that stuff. And Njoku did some really intriguing stuff with the ball in his hand last year. I know a lot of it was with Flacco, but there's reason to be like, well, if they continue to use him as like an outlet player and then let him run after the catch, and he has that low a lot of short catches like they were doing late with Flacco. And I don't know why they wouldn't, because it was suddenly like, man, we unlocked David Njoku. This is the way to use him. Like, instead of having a running back be an outlet, let's use this monster of a man who can run over a guy or jump over him. And he's going to be our block and release dump off guy and catch it at the line of scrimmage and gain 15 yards. So anyway, if they continue to do that with Njoku, I think there's some real upside. Somehow he's going 20 picks behind Ferguson, who is going 40 picks ahead of Dalton Schultz, who went and put up the exact same targets per out run profile he was putting up in Dallas over in Houston. And then Jake Ferguson took over and put up the exact same targets per out run profile that Dalton Schultz had put up in Dallas. It's just routes. It's not like a really extreme volume earning or even efficiency element. I do think Ferguson's going to score some touchdowns, and he's going to be fine, and he's going to run a lot of routes, and there's not a lot of competition for the number 2 targets in Dallas. But I look at that and I go, why is he going 84 in ADP in a really strong tight end year? And Schultz is going 120 something, and Njoku's going 100, and the other guys in between there. Anyway, any big thoughts on Dallas from you?
Well, to speak to the tight end position, one of the just sort of foundational pieces for how I draft, and I think how we draft, is that it is based on talent creating volume and not team context. creating volume because, I mean, you do have players get hurt, obviously, but the one creates more of a moat and creates more of a ceiling if you also have the team context hit in the right way. And then especially if those routes that you're talking about start to be priced somewhat aggressively, then you have a lot more room to lose than you have to win. I mean, this is a team that in a, you know, not everybody in the second round is going to hit, but they have to explain the pick that they used at this position in round 2 a year ago. And maybe their explanation is just like, he's not the receiving tight end. But again, you're talking about round 2, right? So there are some things contextually there that, you know, raise some eyebrows. The Cowboys are a team that is probably disappointing and not particularly interesting from a fantasy perspective because almost all of their moves, both in terms of losing some key guys on the offensive and defensive lines, and then adding back through the draft to the offensive and defensive lines, you know, maybe that ends up being more or less a wash or even a minor step in the right direction for Dallas over the long term, although you are getting younger in the short term and introducing some risk there. But to have, you know, so little depth at wide receiver that Ferguson is the guy, that's problematic. You know, you do also lose Pollard to a weird contract with the Titans, and you say that's not a huge deal. Like, if you make any attempt to address it, right? If you add anybody back in, including 4th and 5th round picks in the draft, then nobody cares about that. But they didn't do it, right? And so when we're looking at CeeDee Lamb and what this team could potentially accomplish in 2024, if the season goes well, which is certainly what the market expects, then, I mean, you're talking about CeeDee Lamb with an excellent chance to replicate what he did last year or even take the next step to where we're talking about him, you know, as an MVP candidate. I mean, that's how good he could be if they flourish despite not having all of these supplementary pieces.
And that's, I mean, a fair point and why he's going 102. But then the flip side of it, you said that's the if things go right scenario. He, by the way, also, I mean, had a career year across the board, all the per route run stuff, but also a pretty big career year in routes run. I mean, they threw a ton last year. That was something that elevated. I was just talking about it, elevating Ferguson. It elevated Lamb's final line a little bit. His yards per out run career high by a lot. Tyreek Hill was more than a yard better in terms of yards per out run. And I've talked about, I think Tyreek Hill should be going ahead of him personally, because I think that volume that he had, his targets per out run, 7 percentage points higher. His yards per target was also better. What Mike McDaniel's shown in an ability to get the ball to Tyreek Hill, even when teams know they want to get the ball to Tyreek Hill, it's something you can really bank on. Even by looking at Waddle, you can see, I mean, he was like 7th in the league in my weighted targets per out run, or 8th in the league. And that's with Tyreek Hill being the runaway number 1 in the same offense. So it's like, if you're not getting the ball to this guy, you're just getting the ball to this guy. You can get it to whoever you want. I say all that because you're talking about Lamb really consolidating the volume, and he could. You said in the good scenarios, but what about the bad scenarios, right? The bad scenarios where no one else steps up and he's getting triple covered every time. I mean, maybe it's not that extreme. And obviously we would expect he's good enough to still beat double coverages and some of those things, but it can be a little bit tricky, right? It can be a little bit of a problem. We saw it with Devontae Adams last year. I don't think people realize Devontae Adams, 2nd in the NFL in targets last year, didn't really have a whole lot around him. Very low efficiency. I mean, some of that's on the quarterback play as well, but hit 175 targets and still finished like well down. I mean, I actually kind of like him as a bounce back because of how he still earned volume last year. But like, even though you can visualize those massive target numbers, if you have nothing else in the passing game, it can be a little bit tricky. It can be a little bit tricky.
It definitely can. I would point out, after I, you know, just made the case against Ferguson and some of the context things, there are situations where I do think part of the context is likely to stay. And if it amplifies an elite talent, then that is always interesting to me. And you've got to be a little bit careful about this and make sure you understand the things that you just noted, which were very important. I do think we're going to get a big gap between Lamb and Hill in routes again in 2024.
They're going to
based
drop
on the
back
way,
a ton. Yeah.
and it could always change. And if it does change for Hill and Waddle, then I mean, you're talking about just, results that are extraordinary. But those guys, the route percentages for them, how they get dinged up, what they're asked to do when they're out there, and how they end up rotating on some plays despite being the two main guys. And one of the things the Dolphins have done a little bit is add not high profile depth, but like depth that you can maybe put out on the field, which they haven't even had that in the past. And so it is frustrating when you go and look at the numbers and you realize that the routes for Hill and Waddle are not where you want them to be. And that's both a positive and a negative, but it is always a little bit of a concern for me there. I mean, one thing just for Dallas is that I think this is a much more fragile team than people realize. And even on the defensive side of the ball, where, again, I think you want to be careful about making too strong or drawing conclusions that are too strong based on this, but we watched them humiliate bad offenses and also struggle against some good offenses. And, that was the thing that, also wrapped into what you were saying about the Commanders there, is that they are getting a defensive coordinator now as their head coach coming off of a season where the defense was extraordinary in all of these games, but was humiliated in the playoff loss. It's a team that has the potential, I think, to make bad teams look really bad, but also just still simultaneously, even despite their huge point differential, right? Which you don't want to ignore, but a team that I don't think matches up that well against the other power teams in the NFC.
Yeah.
And the question for us now is, are the Eagles one of those teams still?
Yeah, and that's a good question. The Cowboy thing is, I mean, it's so fascinating that they got ran out of the gym at home in their one playoff game. And I mean, by all indications, the greatest coach of all time wanted to take over your team, and you stuck with Mike McCarthy. I mean, you could have probably just hired Bill Belichick, who seemed to want to go coach and, follow in Bill Parcells' footsteps. You're talking about,
seems like, I mean, Bill Belichick, his big problem is, like, if he doesn't have Tom Brady and he doesn't have there's probably never been a worse wide receiver evaluation in the history of football, including everybody who has never watched football before, who would just, pick randomly,
right?
Than Bill Belichick. But when you have Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, that's not a problem for you.
That's why, I know everyone's like, oh, he's over the hill, he's lost it. Like, no, Bill Belichick is not. Like, this is a dude that is a scheme encyclopedia. His advantage his whole career has been that he could literally fit talent to scheme in a way that we know that coaches need to do it, rather than trying to, I guess, fit scheme to talent, rather than try to fit talent to scheme. Like, oh, this is my scheme, you have to play a certain role in it, and that always works out poorly. What Belichick has done throughout his entire career on both sides of the ball is whatever whatever talent he has, he's like, well, I have the perfect scheme to utilize these specific players. You're right. He's been bad as a general manager. He could have taken over a team in Dallas that had some really intriguing defensive players that he could have coached up. I mean, think of the stuff he could have done with Michael Parsons. Goes back to, like, you ever hear him talk about Lawrence Taylor and what he was able to do with the Giants defense when he was the defensive coordinator? Obviously, famously, they won the Super Bowl over the Bills, and his defensive game plans in the Hall of Fame from that game. Bill Belichick, the defensive coordinator for Bill Parcells in that game. And he talks about how Lawrence Taylor was so instinctual and such a great player. I mean, I wanted to see what he would have drawn up for Michael Parsons and how to move him around on the line and how to use his athleticism. And they have so many playmakers on the offensive side of the ball that I'm pretty confident he would have found ways to utilize those guys. That's what he's good at. That's what he's always been good at, is like preparing and watching film and understanding scheme and how to exploit it, how to disguise stuff and how to design stuff. And anyway, he's getting up there in age, but like that, you got that, or you got the bumbling Mike McCarthy over here.
Well, but I do want to make sure that as we're going through it, at least for me, that I'm not, giving the impression that I think Mike McCarthy can't do it or shouldn't get credit for, because, with the Green Bay stretch, everybody gives credit to Aaron Rodgers, and then you have Kellen Moore, and he goes and gets, embarrasses himself when he has Justin Herbert. So, and he And then you have Mike McCarthy putting on this scorched earth campaign with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, and frankly, not much else. Right. And so I guess for me, the weird thing is that they go into this offseason and instead of trying to complement that a little bit more, they stick with guys who just, don't even really look like role players. And so it does put a ton of pressure on your QB and your wide receiver. Whereas you look at the Eagles and they finish out the season very, very poorly. Their coaching staff gets embarrassed on both sides of the ball. There's question about, if the head guy should get any of the credit for the things they had done previously because his assistant coaches look good where they go. And yet you look at the offseason for the Eagles and it's much more dynamic than the offseason for the Cowboys. And they were probably the more talented team to start with. And so if we take a little bit longer view and not ignore, but put that, late season fade from Philadelphia into a little bit more context, I mean, I could see the Eagles jumping right back and being the powerhouse and like the clear top team in the NFC East.
So let's go to them. I do want to say for me as well, I wasn't trying to pretend like Mike McCarthy. I think Mike McCarthy is a good coach. I just think there's probably a ceiling to what he can accomplish, basically. I do think he can get exposed. I think LaFleur showed that, and then the Packers showed that, and some of the things that, I mean, you can put that on Dan Quinn defensively and all of that, but he's had moments like that, McCarthy. I think maybe you can call him a good regular season head coach or something. That's maybe not fair either, but I just want to emphasize that I don't think he's like the worst coach in the league. Let's move to the Eagles. I have a very similar feeling. It's a very similar to what we just talked about with the Giants. I think people are clinging too much to 2023. Like, just open your mind to one more year of a sample. We talk about this with football every year. 17 games is not a big sample. Injuries happen. One season does not tell the whole story. Things can spiral in the ways that things can go and for one season. And so often I think there's high expectations as well. And then the failure to hit the expectations leads people to be far too confident that is like a bust, right? Like, I mean, we can talk about this on a player level. We talk about Kyle Pitts, and people don't remember that Kyle Pitts had 1,000-yard season as a age 21, turned 21 in season rookie, and then has an injury the next year, who's struggling, but had an injury during that year, and then reportedly was not super healthy last year. Those are his 3 seasons. Like, some of that came under Arthur Smith, and there's some scheme stuff and all of that as well. So, like, are you that confident that in 50-ish games, I don't even know if he's played that many because he missed some time, but 3 seasons worth of games that you're actually, who that player is? It's a small sample. It's very, very difficult to, but that's why we talk about uncertainty. It's we don't know what we know a lot of the time. We're guessing a lot of the time. And it drives me a little nuts. It's just a point I want to drive home where you have some of these teams and some of these schemes that show an ability to be successful, and then the expectations rise, and then they struggle, and then it's like because they didn't meet the expectations the year prior, right? So we just did this with the Giants. 2022 was a good year. The Eagles, 2022 was a great year for the Eagles. One of the things we talked about last summer with the Eagles, Sean, there was this conversation about how they led by big numbers in the second half of so many games. That's why they didn't throw a lot in the second halves, and that they had a much tougher schedule in 2023, and they were going to have to throw more and be in more contests. And one of the things we talked about is that's not always necessarily a good thing because it could put them in some tougher spots and some tougher situational outcomes. They did end up playing a lot of closer games in 2023. They go 11-6. They still make the playoffs. They get blown out in Tampa Bay in that game, but definitely a tough end to the season. This is actually a team that started last year, 2023, after their Super Bowl run, 10-1, which I don't think anybody really remembers, then lost 5 of their last 6, and then lost the playoff game. So really 6 of their last 7. Really, really fell apart down the stretch. It's a team that things weren't great for them. Jalen Hurts' knee was maybe banged up at times late last year. AJ Brown was fantastic in the first half of the year. Down the stretch, a little more balance. He wasn't giving you these monster games anymore. But I'm with you in just this like general, I guess, regression is so possible here. That's the same general offense that went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago. I do think the loss of Jason Kelsey is about as impactful as a loss of a center can be, where, that's a guy that's probably calling out the signals, all that stuff, and how much they use the tush push. I do have question marks about the tush push. Sean, I know you're not super high on Barkley, but when you talk about the optimism for the Eagles, one of the first things that comes to my mind is Saquon Barkley, who they've gone and added now. If they do lead a little bit more, they're likely to run more. Barkley has never been in a great rushing situation, right? So you're talking about definitely an improvement there, that even without Jason Kelsey, it's a better offensive line than what he's gotten from the Giants. You have the element of Jalen Hurts' mobility, which has helped the rushing efficiency of many an Eagle back. And then I'm still caught up on this tush push thing and Jason Kelsey. Like, do they run the ball with the running back in the red zone a little bit more this year because I don't have that center anymore? Is it possible for Saquon Barkley to have double-digit rushing touchdowns and maybe a 1,500-yard rushing season? He's going really high in the early second round. I have not taken him there. I have taken him a little bit when he slides. I think I've taken him twice when he slides to the late second, just because I'm not totally convinced, especially this is over on Underdog where it's half PPR. We do know that the Eagles are not going to be great for his receiving stats probably. But in a half PPR format, I think there's still some pretty solid potential to his, range of statistical outcomes. It's still not a price that I love, but I want to get a little bit exposure to him because of what you said about the Eagles as a team. I think this rebound could really come in a way that puts them in a lot of positive game script and makes Saquon a really interesting, almost like a bet to lead the NFL in rushing if he's getting a lot of work.
And the thing that I always like to point out to start with to help people understand the context, at least that I'm considering when I talk about Barkley, is that he's a big back, but he plays like a small back, which isn't a problem. You just have to understand that he plays like a small back and think of it from that perspective. And the thing I'm talking about there is the ability to create big plays, but you don't actually break a lot of tackles. And so you need some holes to work with. And that should be there. And we just talked about how the Giants had added a little bit to the offensive line because they ranked 30th in run PE per snap. Well, the Eagles ranked number 1. And so that's relevant in a couple of different ways. It's relevant because no team is positioned to withstand the loss of a Jason Kelsey quite the way that they arguably are. Now, is it going to hurt them? It definitely is going to hurt them. And so you want to factor that into your thinking about it. And yet it's almost sort of this weird dynamic where if they were middle of the pack and you lose that, now you are risking maybe being very bad. Whereas if you're the best run blocking team in the NFL and you lose a key piece, it certainly hurts you, but you might stay closer to the top than is intuitive. So I think that piece is at least vaguely interesting. But the other thing is that Saquon goes from one of the worst run blocking teams to one of the best run blocking teams. And that could potentially open up some of those pathways for him to run through, especially when you have to consider Jalen Hurts also as a runner from a defensive scheme perspective. So even though I'm skeptical about what his overall fantasy ceiling is, if people, want to focus on, or at least be willing to think about a scenario or multiple scenarios, toward the top end of outcomes where he looks really good and, maybe still doesn't return value at that ADP, but is a very exciting player from a reality perspective. That to me is not, a huge leap of faith. You could very easily see that part happen. And then the other thing, again, is just with the context of where they are, the play calling and the performance from Hurts down the stretch was apocalyptic. You can't ignore that, but at the same time, that's almost certainly a bottom 5, if not like a bottom 1% outcome for their 2023 season. And you know that Hurts has been, a borderline MVP player, when you know that they were, maybe one play away from winning a Super Bowl. And when he's surrounded by that much talent, it's like, Are you going to bet that 1% outcome there is the strongest indicator for what the new season is going to be like? Because, I mean, down the stretch of last year, A.J. Brown, starting from week 11, had wildly negative fantasy points over expectation. He had a minus 4.9 game, a minus 4.8 game, a minus 4.4 game, a minus 4.6 game. Are we concerned that AJ Brown is no longer an elite player? I guess I actually don't like his ADP. I don't think it makes sense, but I'm not questioning his ability to play or be a superstar. And what we saw in the second half last season, again, is more evidence that Devontae Smith is an elite number 2. So you're talking about this elite 1-2 punch. They also kind of made a sneaky, fun wide receiver pick at the end of the draft where Johnny Wilson falls well below where it seemed like he should have gone. Maybe if you have an injury, he pops out as an interesting piece at some point. They have Dallas Goedert at tight end. I think that their backup running back is stronger now. So you potentially take some of those Kenneth Gainwell, very negative value plays out of the game, and you don't have them, siphoning value off the table. You get a more normal outcome, and the Eagles are going to be the best team in the NFC East. You get a 95th percentile outcome, and suddenly you've got big gaps, and you're talking again about a Super Bowl contender.
I think you put that stuff all very well. It's Sean. After like the in-season stuff, last year I was still into AJ Brown, but wasn't as into him. Was certainly not as into DJ Moore as I had been. Those are two players that most of my subscribers over at Stealing Signals, I think, associate with me more than others for whatever reason. I mean, well, not for whatever reason, because I write about them.
Because you talk about
Stealing Signals. It's all I talk about. It's literally the only players you talk about. I wasn't very in on them last year. That was a fun little talking point. And then AJ Brown goes out and has the 6 straight games with 125 plus yards, NFL record. That was from week 3 through week 8. It was all in the first half of the year. And DJ Moore has like a 50-point game in like week 6 and is absolutely crushing for the Bears in the early part of the season and ends up having a really strong year himself.
Wait a time.
It was fantastic. Both of those incredible years were fun to watch for a guy who's been in on them every year until last year. No, I mean, I had a little bit of Brown last year, but the reason I'm bringing this up again, Sean, is I'm not drafting either of them at all in my early drafts. Like I was like, yeah, I'm going to be back in on them. Well, DJ Moore got a really lofty price, 2-3 turn. Like he was going to see an increase in pass volume in the offense. You don't have the Justin Fields effect with the scrambling and the sacks taken and all of that I was concerned about for Moore last year. That was going to change. And so I was like, okay, I can at least get into the 2-3 turn thing. But the Keenan Allen trade happened and the Rome Odunze draft pick happened, and DJ Moore still has not fallen in underdog drafts. He's going in sometimes he falls to the mid-third. I have no idea why he still goes where he goes. You can't just not pay attention to all of that other stuff that just happened at wide receiver in your offense. At any rate, I'm not drafting a whole lot of DJ Moore. And then you mentioned the AJ Brown and his ADP and the element there. I actually had to go out of my way to draft him because Garrett Wilson's going right behind him. And I like Garrett Wilson multiple spots ahead of where he's going. Puka Nacua is going right ahead of Brown. And if I get that choice, I want to make sure I get some exposure to Nacua because I'm taking Wilson over Nacua in other spots. And I want to still get some Nacua. Brown's the one that has to fall into a spot where both Nacua and Garrett Wilson have gone off, and then I take him, but it just doesn't happen a lot of the time and when you're in those draft slots. And so I went out of my way to draft him over, I think, Garrett Wilson in a draft. Okay, I'll take an AJ Brown share, but he was, of all the first round picks, I think the one that I had not yet drafted. He was the last of the top 12, which is a pretty strong top 12 this year for people who haven't done a whole lot of drafting. It falls off after 12, 13. There's a whole clear tier break. It's really hard to get even, at the 111 to get 2 of the top 12. To get one at 111 and one at 202 is rare. You just don't see the guys that are ranked 14th and 15th in ADP go in the top 12. So Brown is in that top 12. I kind of tend to agree with you that people are not responding to what happened after that stretch of 125 yards Maybe that had more to do with Hurts's injury. Maybe that had more to do with Brown himself being banged up. He ended up being inactive for the playoff game because he got hurt in week 18 and left that game early. He had a lot of volume though down the stretch, and you mentioned the fantasy points over expectation being negative week in and week out. A lot of tricky outcomes when you look at his game log, inefficiency, stuff that isn't like AJ Brown. I've had some tough decisions to make in some dynasty leagues this offseason as well, because I think I would suggest for Brown, who turns 27 in about a week here, or excuse me, a month and a week, late June, that this is probably the time where you can get full price in Dynasty still, or close to full price in Dynasty still. He's still going in the first round in redraft, that you need to start thinking about trading 1 year early rather than 1 year late, like we talk about in Dynasty. I'm a huge fan of the talent, obviously, and always will be, and want to have exposure to him. But I agree with your take there. I agree with your take that his ADP doesn't seem to be weighing in what happened down the stretch last year. He was going at the late first last year, and I think we got more evidence last year that price baked in a lot of what is a high floor, I think, but also baked in a lot of the potential ceiling, that he's probably not going to be having top 5 seasons in this offense with Jalen Hurts with a little bit of a run lean. It's just not in the cards there. Even in a year last year, he wound up getting 158 targets. That's a big number, but there's some of these situations where you can tell yourself pretty easily the guy's going to have 200 targets we just talked about it with CeeDee Lamb and some of those situations. So anyway, that will be interesting. I agree with your general premise of the Eagles. The other player I want to talk about a little bit is Dallas Goedert, who is another one of those nobody remembers anything before last year guys, where he's going. It's a competitive tight end landscape in ADP, but he's going like tight end 12, tight end 13, whatever it is. And I just was in a slow draft literally earlier today. I got him 30 picks after his ADP. I got him at like 140 because people are just like not into drafting Dallas Goedert.
You must have missed today's news.
What was today's news?
I'm kidding.
Oh God, see, that's what I thought it was, and I went and looked it up. And as soon as you said that, I was like, I did miss today's news, because that's what I thought must have been the case. But you go back to 2022, Dallas Goedert didn't earn a ton of targets per route in the year that AJ Brown came over, but a really high yards per target. The year prior, even higher, really strong yards per out run both of those years. The conversation for Dallas Goedert going into 2023 was, this is a guy that doesn't even need a ton of targets because he's so efficient. And even the years prior to that, solid efficiency, if not great. But he can be such an efficient player, even at limited routes, because he doesn't run a ton of routes. Last year, the yards per target was a career low. The efficiency just wasn't there. It wasn't there across the passing game. Maybe Jalen Hurts was hurt. We just talked about this with AJ Brown. There are concerns. Now, it could also bounce back for AJ Brown. I mean, I want to make that point clear too. The second half stuff might not be indicative of anything. I'm just a little bit concerned at his price. Goddard, the price that we're talking about is so low that I'm like, I mean, this is a fairly easy bounce back bet, at least, or it seems like to me. If you get to that point and you haven't addressed tight end yet, that was the first time I drafted him, I think, because I'm taking so many earlier tight ends. The prices are so strong in that elite tier in rounds 5, 6, 7. But I don't know. What do you think about Goddard? Do you think that we're overreacting to a down 2023? It was his career low in yards per out run, but the previous 4 years were all very much better. And the previous 2 years were a lot better. Just seems like we're not looking at the long view with this player.
He's an interesting guy because there have been some injury elements in there, and that, I think, has derailed potential progress in the offense. And it is something as well where he goes out and suddenly Devontae Smith catches fire. And so for me, one of the things to, at least think about a little bit is that, I mean, the Eagles should understand that Smith is the guy, maybe even ahead of AJ Brown, which I know is a blasphemous type of thing to say, but he has got to be a focal point of this offense if you want it to take that leap again. I think much more than the tight end. And when you look at Goddard and you think about another element there that maybe hurts the ceiling in terms of someone where, over the last couple of years, that ADOT has plummeted. Now, part of that is, more generalized NFL trends, but I don't think he's the guy from 2020 or 2021 within this offense. I mean, he's maybe a player where the price works for you. And so anybody who is mixing in some shares of Goddard, I think that makes sense. My hope would be that he is not the player who ends up getting emphasized in this offense. So Ben Smith,
Shawn,
all in on Smith.
You've talked about Smith catching fire a number of times. He had a strong run of touchdowns, 4 out of 5 games from week 8 to week 13. And in 4 of those games, he also had 95 plus yards. So it was a really strong
like fire.
5-game stretch there. After that, the 4 games down the stretch, no more than 80 yards in any of them, 1 TD. Prior to that, he had 2 TDs and only 1 game of 80 yards. He had 5 games all year over 80 yards. He did have 148 yards in their one playoff game that AJ Brown missed. But I mean,
and when Brown wasn't there, again, superstar. Let's get him going.
He had, including the playoff game, 2 games of 125 plus yards. AJ Brown broke the NFL record for consecutive 125 plus yard games with 6 in a row. It's a little bit of a different scope of catching fire in terms of their hot streak in hot areas of the season. When I look at these game logs,
what I'm going to take from this is that Ben agrees with me that maybe even more than AJ Brown, Devontae Smith should be the offensive focal point. The other little thing here, Ben,
that's what you're going to take from that.
But I think is, maybe a below the radar type of thing, again, for those of us who are focusing a lot on fantasy, because the offense had the pieces in place, even with the collapse. When you have Smith and Brown and Goddard and Hurts, then you can actually go out and address this defense that was in a full-blown collapse after they lose their coordinator and lose some interesting pieces. They make an emphasis on the D and free agency. They go and draft 2 corners, including trading up for the second corner. And so it was a pretty big move there to jump a handful of spots. They obviously love those guys. Part of the thesis for them to bounce back and be the best team in the NFC East is going to rely on that defense playing better. It was a train wreck. It should be maybe not vastly, but significantly improved. Do you have Do you have an NFC East champion?
I think the Eagles. I do like the Eagles to win the division and bounce back. I was going to say we are, for the listeners on our longer show, we are bearing down on 2 hours, and we've gotten through 2 of the divisions. Once again, this week, our Stealing Banana shorts are not going to be very short.